Dorian Marchetti walked into the small Italian restaurant hoping to give Isla a quiet evening that felt normal. For a mafia boss known for power and control, this simple plan mattered more than anything else. Isla tried to enjoy her meal, but her face tightened and her hands began to shake. She broke down at the table, and Dorian had no idea how to comfort her. A waitress named Marin Voss rushed in and understood something he missed. She told him Isla just wanted a mom, and those words opened a wound that someone dangerous would soon use against them. Dorian chose that restaurant because it looked peaceful from the outside, and he hoped the calm setting would help Isla forget the weight she carried. He guided her to a corner table away from the window, trying to shield her from unwanted attention. Isla studied the menu with interest at first, and he felt a small sense of relief watching her focus. He wanted the night to feel easy, even though he knew nothing in his world ever stayed simple. For a brief moment he thought this dinner might actually work. The staff watched Dorian with quiet curiosity because they rarely saw a man with his reputation acting like any other parent. He ordered gently, trying to keep the tone steady so Isla wouldn't feel pressured. The restaurant lights created a warm glow across the table, softening the usual sharpness in his expression. Isla swung her legs back and forth, making light taps on the seat, something she did when she felt safe. Dorian hoped this would be one of those rare nights when she could forget the heaviness surrounding their lives. Isla picked up her fork and began arranging pieces of bread into small shapes on her plate. Dorian watched, letting her play as long as she wanted. Her quiet focus usually meant she felt calm, and he didn't want to interrupt that. He checked his phone once to make sure none of his men had sent a message about trouble. Seeing nothing urgent, he put it away again. Isla looked up for a moment and offered a small smile, and he felt something ease inside his chest, believing the night was going well. Dorian kept glancing around the restaurant, making sure no unwanted faces appeared. Even on peaceful nights, he stayed alert without thinking about it. Isla leaned toward the window, tracing the rim of her glass with her fingertip. The sight made him think of Amelia, who used to do the same thing during dinners. He tried not to drift into memories, but they always found him. He adjusted his posture, trying to stay present for Isla, reminding himself that this night was for her, not for the shadows that lived in his thoughts. A soft Italian song started playing, one that Amelia used to hum while cooking at home. Isla paused, recognizing the melody even though she couldn't name it. Her shoulders tightened and she looked down at her plate. Dorian's breath caught for a second, realizing the song might pull emotions he wasn't ready to handle. He scanned the room for anyone paying attention, but most people kept talking, unaware of the shift at his table. Isla's fingers curled into her lap, and Dorian knew the moment he feared was approaching quicker than he expected. Isla's mood began to change as her small hands pushed her food back and forth without taking a bite. Dorian leaned closer, hoping she would look up at him, but her eyes stayed fixed on the table. She pressed her lips together, trying to stay calm, and he recognized the pattern from nights when memories overwhelmed her. He wished he could remove the reminder entirely, but music like that found its way into public places. He kept his voice steady and reassuring, hoping she would find her comfort again, even though he wasn't sure how. Dorian reached into his coat pocket and took out a small wooden toy shaped like a lion, something Isla always loved. He placed it near her hand, hoping it would help her focus on something familiar. Isla touched it lightly but didn't smile. She held it for a moment, then set it down again. Dorian felt the weight of helplessness settling on his shoulders. He could command men across the city, negotiate contracts, and face danger without blinking, yet he struggled to understand the one person who meant everything to him. Isla's breathing turned uneven, and her shoulders began to tremble. She lifted her hands to her face as tears gathered, shaking her head as though she didn't want to cry, but couldn't stop. Dorian froze, unsure how to reach her, because comfort never came easily to him. The conversations in the room slowly faded as people noticed the growing distress at their table. Isla tried to stay quiet, but the emotions overwhelmed her. Dorian leaned closer, wishing he knew what to say or do, wishing he could undo whatever triggered this sudden pain. Dorian rose slightly from his seat, not sure whether to lift Isla into his arms or let her stay where she sat. He tried brushing her hair back, but she pulled away, confused and overwhelmed. Her tears continued falling, harder than before, and the restaurant grew still. Dorian felt exposed, as though every pair of eyes saw his failure to comfort his own child. His hands hovered near her shoulders, but he couldn't find a way to steady her. He whispered her name softly, hoping she would react, but she continued shaking uncontrollably. Customers nearby turned their heads, watching the scene unfold with concern and curiosity. Some lowered their forks, unsure whether to step in or remain silent. Others whispered, surprised to see a figure like Dorian in such a vulnerable position. A few servers exchanged glances, trying to decide who should approach the table. The sudden attention pressed in from all directions, and Dorian's composure slipped. He wanted to shield Isla from every stare, but he didn't know how to do that without making things worse. The moment felt endless, stretching beyond his control. Maren Voss, the waitress assigned to their section, stepped forward with steady movements. She had been watching Isla from a distance, waiting to see if anyone else would help. When no one acted, she made her way to the table. Her eyes focused on Isla, not Dorian, and she crouched beside the little girl with calm awareness. Maren had worked with children before, and recognized the signs of emotional overload. She kept her posture gentle, using her presence rather than words to guide Isla's attention away from the growing crowd around them. Maren lowered herself to Isla's level and placed a soft hand on the edge of the table, creating a small anchor point for the child to focus on. Isla's sobs quieted slightly as she glanced toward Maren's steady expression. Maren breathed slowly and Isla mirrored the rhythm without thinking. The noise in the restaurant faded for Isla as she focused on the new, calmer presence beside her. Dorian watched with confusion, wondering how Maren managed to reach Isla so easily. For the first time that night, Isla's shaking began to ease. Isla leaned into Maren's side as though she found something familiar in the waitress's warmth. Maren reached for a napkin and gently dabbed Isla's cheeks, careful not to overwhelm her. Isla clutched Maren's arm lightly, holding on to her as if she had known her far longer than a few minutes. Dorian felt a strange mix of relief and sadness watching his daughter settle against someone else. The rest of the customers relaxed slightly as Isla's crying softened. The quiet connection between Isla and Maren seemed to grow without either of them forcing it. Maren lifted her eyes toward Dorian, and the honesty in her expression cut straight through him. She understood something he hadn't wanted anyone to say out loud. Her simple observation that Isla only wanted a mother struck him with more force than any threat he had faced. The room went silent as people processed what Maren had revealed. Dorian's expression shifted, breaking the mask he kept on at all times. Maren didn't realize she had stepped into territory far deeper than a child's tears. Her words touched a wound still very raw. Dorian paid the bill without saying a word and guided Isla outside, keeping his coat around her shoulders. He avoided eye contact with everyone, feeling exposed in a way he rarely experienced. Isla rested against him, exhausted from her outburst. When they reached the car, she fell asleep almost immediately. Dorian sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine. Maren's words echoed again and again, pulling up memories he fought to bury. The quiet street outside the restaurant felt heavy with thoughts he couldn't outrun. Dorian stood beside his car in the dim streetlight, holding the steering wheel with both hands as Maren's words echoed in his head. He had spent years hiding the truth about Amelia's death behind a quiet story of an accident, and hearing a stranger speak so directly felt like someone pulling back a curtain he never wanted touched. Isla slept soundly in the back seat, unaware of the turmoil inside him. He waited until his thoughts stopped racing enough to drive, then pulled into the road, needing the silence of home to collect himself again. Back home, Dorian carried Isla to her room and tucked her under a soft blanket embroidered with tiny stars. Her toy lion fell from her hand onto the pillow, and he placed it gently beside her. Once she settled, he stepped into the hallway, letting the door close with a quiet click. The house felt larger than usual, almost hollow, and every corner reminded him of what was missing. He walked toward his office, needing a moment to think, even though he already knew where his mind would take him. Inside his office, Dorian opened a drawer he rarely touched and pulled out a framed photo of Amelia. She stood near a garden, smiling at the camera with Isla as a toddler in her arms. Dorian held the frame tightly, feeling the familiar pull of regret and unfinished business. The investigation into her death had been rushed, and people had given him answers that never sat right. He placed the photo on the desk, forcing himself to confront the memories he had buried under work and responsibility. Maren's words had stirred everything back to the surface. He remembered every detail of the night Amelia died, from the urgent call he received to the look on the detective's face when he arrived. They had claimed it was a tragic incident without clear evidence, and the case was closed far too quickly. Dorian suspected foul play, but pressure from inside his organization made him hesitate to push further. Now, thinking about the timing, the behavior of certain lieutenants, and the rise in disloyalty, he wondered if he had missed signs that were right in front of him. His trust in people had always been fragile. A knock on the office door broke his thoughts as his most trusted lieutenant entered with a set of files. The lieutenant reported subtle unrest spreading through the organization, mentioning rumors of dissatisfaction and plans forming behind closed doors. Dorian listened quietly, realizing the loose threads in his operations were starting to show. He felt the same pressure that had been building for months, but now it carried a new weight because of Marin's unexpected involvement. He dismissed the lieutenant with a nod, knowing he needed time to consider every detail with clear focus. Dorian opened the files and studied the names associated with recent incidents. Several men had begun shifting their loyalty, moving in ways that suggested a hidden leader influencing them. He recognized patterns of rebellion he had seen in other families years ago. His instincts sharpened as he realized someone inside his own circle might have taken advantage of Amelia's vulnerability. He stared at the names, weighing their history, their behavior, and their positions. The deeper he looked, the more he sensed that this unrest was tied to events far older than the recent tension. Despite his growing concerns, Dorian's thoughts kept returning to Isla's breakdown at the restaurant. He replayed the moment she reached for Marin instead of him, and wondered why the connection formed so quickly. He wasn't jealous. He was confused. He had struggled for years to soothe Isla when she felt overwhelmed, but Marin had managed it within minutes. It made him wonder whether Isla missed, not just a mother but a steady presence he couldn't always provide. The realization sat heavy on him as he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He stepped out of his office and walked quietly to Isla's room. The door was slightly open, and the faint glow of a nightlight cast soft shapes across the floor. Isla slept peacefully, her breathing steady and untroubled. Dorian stood in the doorway, thinking about the tears earlier and the way she clung to Marin. He felt grateful for the comfort Marin offered, but also shaken by how deeply his daughter reacted. He knew he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Isla needed more than safety and routine. She needed warmth. He had struggled to recreate alone. Dorian pulled the door closed and returned to the dim hallway, walking slowly toward the living room. The quiet felt heavy, but not in a way that frightened him. Instead, it pushed him to accept questions he had avoided since Amelia's death. He could protect Isla from outside threats, but he couldn't shield her from the emptiness she felt. He wondered if returning to the restaurant again would help or make things more complicated. Still, the way Isla calmed in Marin's presence stayed with him. He knew he would take her back, even if he wasn't ready. A few days later, Dorian parked outside the restaurant again. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if this decision came from practicality or something deeper. Isla seemed happier as they walked in, scanning the tables as though searching for Marin. Dorian noticed the change and felt an unexpected sense of relief. He guided Isla to their usual spot, watching her bounce lightly on her toes. The staff recognized them and exchanged quiet glances, unsure what to expect. Dorian kept his posture calm, even though part of him braced for another emotional moment. Marin stepped out from behind the counter and greeted them with warm familiarity. Isla lit up immediately and reached for her hand without hesitation. Marin's expression softened as she took the little girl's hand, guiding her to their table. Dorian observed the exchange carefully, noting the ease with which Isla connected. He offered a small nod of appreciation that Marin returned with modest humility. The simple interaction felt strangely grounding, giving Dorian a sense of stability he hadn't expected to find in a restaurant he discovered by chance. Isla settled into her seat and began coloring with the crayons Marin brought over. Her obvious comfort eased the tightness in Dorian's chest. Marin checked on them frequently without hovering, giving Isla the space to explore while keeping a calming presence nearby. Dorian felt grateful for these small gestures even though he didn't say anything. Watching Marin move through the room with quiet confidence made him wonder how someone like her ended up working in such a modest place. She carried a steady strength that hinted at a deeper story he couldn't yet read. The evening unfolded peacefully, with Isla coloring and humming softly, while Marin balanced her work with subtle attention to their table. Dorian found himself relaxing for the first time in weeks. The atmosphere, the familiar seating, and Isla's contentment created a welcome sense of relief. Other customers noticed the special bond growing between the waitress and the child. A few whispered quietly, surprised to see a Mafia figure softened by the company of an ordinary woman. Dorian ignored the remarks, focusing instead on Isla's calm face and the rare moment of simple connection unfolding before him. As the meal continued, Dorian paid closer attention to Marin, observing details he missed during their tense first meeting. Her movements were gentle yet efficient, and she seemed to have an instinct for when Isla needed reassurance. She offered small smiles that brought ease rather than pressure. Dorian remained careful not to misinterpret kindness, but he couldn't deny the effect she had. He felt his guard waver each time she approached the table, not in a dangerous way, but in a way that reminded him he was still human, even in a life built on control. The staff's conversations softened when Maren moved near Dorian's table, as if they wanted to understand what drew him back so often. Dorian noticed but didn't react. He focused entirely on Isla, whose drawing now featured a stick figure version of Maren holding her hand. The picture struck him with unexpected emotion. He folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his coat pocket. Maren caught the gesture and smiled gently. The moment carried a quiet warmth he didn't allow himself to feel often. For the first time he wondered what future these interactions might lead to. A man seated near the back caught Dorian's attention when he looked into the polished surface of his spoon and saw the man staring at their table. The stranger didn't eat or speak. He only watched with steady focus. Dorian stayed still, letting his expression remain neutral while his mind sharpened. He had experience with men who studied him, and this one carried the look of someone gathering information. Dorian reached for his napkin as though adjusting it, but he used the motion to scan the room again. The man's eyes didn't shift away. Marcos noticed the same man a few minutes later when she passed by his booth. Something about his posture seemed out of place, too rigid for someone simply having dinner. She kept serving tables but continued glancing in his direction. Dorian saw her brief look and recognized that she sensed the same problem. Isla remained unaware, absorbed in her drawing. Dorian considered confronting the man but decided against causing a scene near his daughter. He waited for a moment when the strange watcher might reveal his intentions or make a mistake. Before Dorian could act, the man stood up, tossed a few bills onto the table, and walked out without touching his food. Dorian's jaw tightened as he watched the man exit onto the street. He signaled one of his drivers stationed nearby to follow discreetly. Maren paused near Dorian's table, noticing the tension in his shoulders but unsure how to respond. Isla stayed distracted, humming quietly. Dorian assured himself that the situation was under control, yet something about the timing bothered him. The visit didn't feel random, and he knew better than to ignore it. Outside, the driver followed the man through several blocks until he blended into a crowded area and disappeared. The report came back quickly. No name, no background, no clear motive. Dorian didn't like loose ends, especially ones tied to places he visited with Isla. Marian returned to her tasks, unaware of the details unfolding outside. She only sensed a lingering shift in the air near their table. Dorian kept his expression unreadable as he paid the bill. He left a steady tip, collected Isla, and prepared to leave, even though his focus stayed fixed on the stranger. When Dorian reached the car, he placed Isla in her seat and scanned the street again. No one unusual appeared nearby, but he still felt the presence of the watcher. He instructed his driver to extend surveillance around the restaurant for the next several days. This place had become important to Isla, and he would not allow threats to slip through unnoticed. Inside the restaurant, Maren tidied their table, sensing the unease she couldn't identify. She wondered whether Dorian returned for comfort or simply routine. Neither answer felt complete, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfolding around them. Over the next few days, Dorian noticed that Isla kept asking to visit the restaurant again. Her bright enthusiasm convinced him that being near Maren helped her more than anything else he had tried. He drove them back without hesitation. The restaurant felt familiar now, like a safe corner separate from the rest of his world. Maren greeted them warmly, and Isla rushed to show her a new drawing she made at home. Dorian watched from behind, feeling a rare sense of calm settle over him as the two shared a small moment of joy. Maren brought extra bread and a few small crayons in colors Isla hadn't used before. The simple gesture made Isla giggle quietly and start coloring right away. Dorian's gaze followed Maren as she moved through the room, effortlessly balancing her tasks. She brought comfort without trying too hard, and Dorian admired that quality more than he expected. He remained cautious, knowing attachments in his world could lead to consequences. Yet he couldn't deny the ease he felt each time they sat in her section. The security reports remained quiet, but he kept his guard raised. Other customers noticed the way Dorian relaxed in Maren's presence, something they had never seen in public. Some whispered quietly, curious about the connection forming between a powerful Mafia figure and a small-town waitress. Dorian didn't pay attention to the curiosity around him. His only concern was how comfortable Isla seemed next to Maren. The child laughed softly while coloring, something she rarely did outside the house. Marin caught Dorian watching and smiled, sending a warmth through him he hadn't expected. The simple moments felt like small pockets of peace carved out of chaos. Marin collected their empty plates and noticed a thin scar on Dorian's knuckle, a mark that hinted at a violent past. She didn't judge him for it, but it made her realize he carried a life far more difficult than his calm expression revealed. Dorian noticed her brief glance and shifted his hand away without speaking. He appreciated that Marin didn't stare or question him like others often did. The quiet respect between them grew each time they crossed paths. Isla continued drawing, fully content while the adults around her exchanged unspoken thoughts. Dorian watched Marin walk away to help another table, noticing how she kept her focus steady even as she moved through a busy shift. Her calm manner and balanced steps left an impression on him. He wasn't used to noticing the small details of someone else's routine, but Marin drew his attention without trying. As Isla finished her drawing, she reached out to hand it to Marin, eager for her reaction. The gesture brought a soft smile to Dorian's face. He slipped the drawing into his coat once more, recognizing how meaningful Marin had become in their lives. Dorian returned with Isla several times over the next week, building a quiet routine that felt steady and comforting. Each visit followed a similar pattern. Isla greeted Marin with excitement. Marin welcomed them with her warm patience, and Dorian observed from a short distance, trying to understand the unexpected shift taking place. Their table became a small island of calm in his otherwise complicated world. Even the staff adjusted to the pattern, preparing their section without being asked. Dorian kept his guard raised, yet every visit made it harder to ignore how naturally things fit together. Marin began learning small details about Isla, noticing her favorite colors, the food she avoided, and the way she traced circles on the table when she grew nervous. Isla responded well to the attention and spoke more freely around her, sometimes showing Marin her drawings or tiny collections of stickers. Dorian watched, grateful yet unsure how to express it. Marin treated Isla with gentle familiarity, never forcing conversation or overwhelming her. The bond between them grew steadily, turning the restaurant into a place Isla looked forward to rather than feared. Dorian found himself returning without hesitation. As Isla grew more comfortable, she started telling Marin stories about her day in short, simple pieces. Marin listened fully, offering small nods of encouragement that made Isla brighten. Dorian observed how easily Isla opened up to her, something she rarely did even with close family members. The restaurant staff noticed the change, surprised by the little girl's confidence. Dorian felt a mixture of relief and something close to gratitude, though he kept those feelings quiet. He knew Isla needed consistent warmth, and Marin provided it naturally. The shift eased tensions he had carried for months. Dorian couldn't ignore the fact that Isla smiled more during these visits than she had at home. She laughed at small things, hummed while coloring, and reached for Marin with trust he hadn't seen in a long time. Marin became a steady presence. Isla looked for the moment they walked through the door. Dorian appreciated the comfort she brought, but he also felt unsure about how close this connection might pull them. He kept reminding himself that kindness didn't mean obligation, yet every moment made it harder to maintain emotional distance. Other customers began commenting on how different Dorian appeared when he visited the restaurant with Isla. Instead of the intimidating figure most recognized, he seemed calm and focused on his daughter's happiness. Marin treated him like any other parent, never showing fear or judgment, which made their interactions feel surprisingly normal. The staff grew more relaxed around him, offering better service and small gestures of friendliness. Dorian didn't fully understand why this place held such an effect on him, but he recognized that the atmosphere Marin created helped lower the weight he carried every day. Mar couldn't help noticing that Dorian seemed to carry a deep loneliness behind his composed exterior. She didn't pry, but she felt it each time he watched Isla with a mixture of love and worry. She wondered how much he managed alone, especially after seeing how sensitive Isla could be. Marka never treated him differently because of his reputation. She focused on the father sitting at her table. Still, she sensed a complexity in him that stretched far beyond what most people saw. The more she observed, the more she realized he wasn't as cold as rumors suggested. Dorian's thoughts often drifted to Marin when he wasn't at the restaurant. He tried to understand why her presence calmed not only Isla but also him. He wasn't searching for connection, yet he felt drawn to the steadiness she carried. She managed the chaos of her job with a grace he respected. He found himself thinking about the way she listened, the way she moved, and the way she made Isla feel safe. These thoughts unsettled him because attachments in his world came with consequences he didn't want to risk exposing anyone to. Every time he entered the restaurant, Dorian asked for Marin's section without thinking twice. The staff learned to guide him there, unless the area was full. Marin always approached with a warm expression that put Isla at ease immediately. The consistency formed a rhythm that felt reassuring to both father and daughter. Dorian noticed how natural the habit became, even though he never admitted it aloud. He respected routines because they offered stability, and Marin had unknowingly become part of one that grounded him. Her presence created a sense of normalcy he rarely experienced. Isla began drawing pictures of Marin more often, usually placing herself holding Marin's hand or sitting near her. She handed these drawings to Marin shyly, waiting for a reaction. Marin always thanked her warmly, offering gentle encouragement that made Isla glow with pride. Dorian watched each exchange closely, feeling something shift inside him every time Isla smiled. He kept the drawings tucked safely inside his coat, not wanting to lose any memory of the calm moments Marin helped create. These small gestures meant more to him than he expected, reminding him of what he had lost. Dorian slipped another drawing into his coat pocket and wondered why these simple moments felt so significant. He wasn't used to being moved by everyday kindness, and yet Marin's presence affected both Isla and him in ways he couldn't deny. He appreciated her without expecting anything in return. Watching Isla feel safe again gave him a sense of hope he didn't realize he still had. Even though he tried to keep things simple, he couldn't ignore the possibility that their lives were slowly intertwining in ways none of them planned. One evening, while sitting with Isla, Dorian noticed a man seated alone in the back of the restaurant. The man wasn't eating or checking a menu, he only stared at their table with fixed attention. Dorian pretended not to notice, using the reflective surface of his water glass to study him. The man's posture, stiff and alert, reminded Dorian of scouts used to gather information. His instincts sharpened as he watched for subtle movements. He didn't want Isla to sense any tension, so he remained composed while quietly assessing the stranger's intentions. Marin saw the same man after refilling drinks for nearby tables. Something about him felt out of place, as though he wasn't there for dinner, but for observation. She tried to stay focused on her tasks while casting occasional glances at him. The man never shifted his gaze, and she felt a faint concern she couldn't explain. Dorian noticed her awareness and gave a slight nod, confirming that he had seen the same thing. Marin didn't know what they were dealing with, but she understood enough to stay cautious without alarming Isla. Dorian leaned back in his chair and used the angle to observe the stranger more clearly. His men knew how to watch without being obvious, but this man lacked finesse. It made Dorian realize the watcher wasn't part of his organization, which raised new questions. He noticed the stranger's attention wasn't only on him, but also on Marin whenever she passed by. That detail bothered him more than anything. Dorian kept his posture calm while his mind weighed possibilities, preparing to act once he got Isla safely out of the area. Before Dorian could signal his men, the stranger stood up suddenly, placed money on the table, and walked out the door without touching his food. Dorian watched the motion carefully, recognizing a quick exit designed to avoid confrontation. He tapped his phone under the table, alerting his driver to follow the man at a distance. Marin paused near their table, noticing Dorian's attention fixed on the exit. Isla continued drawing, unaware of the tension. Dorian maintained a steady expression, waiting to hear from his driver, even though he already anticipated trouble. Inside the kitchen, Marin stepped aside to gather herself. The stranger's behavior left her uneasy, though she didn't know why. She wondered if Dorian's presence had attracted the attention, or if the man's focus on her meant something more troubling. She returned to the dining area, trying not to let her worry show. The restaurant continued its usual rhythm, but Marin sensed a shift she couldn't define. She avoided looking toward the door again, trusting that Dorian understood far more about these situations than she did. Deep down, she hoped the stranger wouldn't return. Outside, Dorian's driver followed the stranger through several blocks. The man walked with quick steps, glancing around as if checking whether he was being watched. Traffic grew heavier as the driver kept a steady but distant pace. Eventually, the man disappeared into a busy area filled with small shops and street vendors. The driver sent a message confirming he lost sight of him. Dorian expected that outcome but still felt irritation at the loose end. He scanned the restaurant again, reassuring himself that Isla remained completely unaware of the danger passing quietly at the edges of their evening. Dorian gave a subtle order through his phone for additional surveillance around the restaurant. He didn't want to transform the place into a security zone, but he couldn't ignore the threat. 2 men were instructed to monitor the area from unmarked cars and watch for anyone lingering too long. Dorian preferred handling things quietly, especially around Emla, who needed normalcy more than anything. Marin continued her work, unaware that the restaurant had become part of Dorian's protected territory. His precautions tightened in the background, setting the foundation for what would come next. Marin returned to check on Dorian and Isla, noticing his calm posture but sensing something beneath it. He thanked her with a slight nod as she refilled their water. She didn't push for explanations, trusting that whatever unsettled him wasn't her place to question. The rest of the staff moved around the room normally, unaware that Dorian had already taken steps to secure the restaurant. Marin carried on, unaware of how her involvement in their lives had changed everything. She just focused on keeping Isla comfortable, unaware of the growing danger that circled quietly outside. Toward the end of the meal, Isla reached upward with her arms as Marin walked by, wanting to be held. Marin lifted her gently and swayed her for a moment, creating a peaceful rhythm. Isla settled comfortably, and Marin rubbed her back with soft, reassuring motions. Dorian watched closely, feeling gratitude he couldn't express. Isla clung to Marin as though she trusted her completely. As they prepared to leave, Isla pressed her face into Marin's shoulder, reluctant to go. The small scene touched Dorian deeply, reminding him of everything Isla missed since Amelia's passing. Dorian guided Isla toward the car after the meal, noticing that her mood stayed steady for the rest of the evening. Marco waved them off from the doorway, unaware of Dorian's watchful eyes tracking the street around them. Isla rested her head against Dorian's chest as he carried her. Although the evening had started with a small worry, it ended with a calmness he rarely experienced. As he placed Isla in her seat, he couldn't shake the lingering question about the stranger who watched them so intently. The sense of a larger threat began forming quietly in his mind. The next morning, Marin walked home after her shift feeling drained but unaware of how closely she was being monitored. As she moved through quieter streets, she sensed someone behind her. A dark car followed slowly, matching her pace from a distance. She tried to convince herself it was coincidence, adjusting her route to test whether the car would continue trailing her. It did. A tight unease built inside her, and she quickened her steps. The car eventually turned down another street, leaving her unsure whether she had imagined the attention or narrowly avoided real danger. Marco reached her apartment building and waited at the entrance for a moment, scanning the street for any sign of the car. With nothing unusual in sight, she unlocked the door and slipped inside. Her hands felt unsteady, though she couldn't pinpoint the reason. The hallway lights flickered slightly as she walked toward her unit. She told herself she had overreacted, trying to brush off the experience as exhaustion. Still, the quiet tension stayed at the back of her mind. She locked her door carefully, checked the peephole twice, and tried to move on with the night. Dorian received a message from his security team later that evening, showing a grainy photo of Marin walking home with a suspicious car trailing behind her. He studied the image closely, recognizing patterns used by people trying to intimidate rather than harm. The realization struck him harder than expected. Someone was using Marin to get his attention. The thought stirred anger and concern he hadn't felt in years. He rubbed his forehead and leaned back in his chair, realizing he needed to act fast before the situation escalated. Marin had no idea she was caught in a dangerous crosscurrent. Dorian called for one of his most trusted bodyguards and gave orders for a silent watch over Marin. He wanted her protected without knowing the extent of the danger or who was involved. The bodyguard understood and left immediately to track Marin's routine. Dorian trusted him because of his years of loyalty and discipline. As he waited for updates, the weight of the situation pressed on him. He never imagined that a simple moment in a restaurant could draw Marin into his world. Yet the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that she was now a target. The next morning, Marin stepped out of her apartment, unaware that Dorian's bodyguard stood half a block away, observing her movements. She went about her day normally, but she sensed something new in the air, as if someone else was paying attention. At the bus stop, she noticed the same man from before watching her again. He didn't approach or speak, he only stood nearby with steady focus. Marin tried to ignore it and boarded the bus, hoping the uneasy feeling would fade. She didn't realize the watchers around her were part of a much larger problem. The man at the bus stop never tried to speak to Marin, but his constant presence weighed on her. Each day he stood in roughly the same area, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, eyes fixed on her with unwavering attention. Marin told herself he might simply be another commuter, yet something about his posture suggested purpose. She tried focusing on her route, her job and her routine, but the awareness of being watched followed her everywhere. She didn't know that Dorian's bodyguard observed the entire scene from a distance, noting every movement with practiced precision. Marin mentioned her concern to a coworker during a slow moment at the restaurant, but the coworker brushed it off, assuming she was overthinking. Marin tried to laugh it away, yet her worry didn't fade. She noticed how often her eyes drifted toward the windows or the doors, checking if the man appeared again. Serving tables became harder as her mind kept racing. She didn't want to seem paranoid, especially since she had no proof of any real threat. Still, something about the man's steady attention made her feel like she had stepped into the path of something hidden. Meanwhile, Dorian received regular updates from his bodyguard about the watchers near Marin. His anger grew, not from fear but from the fact that someone dared to involve her in his business. Marin had no ties to his world except through Isla, yet someone decided she mattered enough to track. Dorian paced across his office, thinking through possibilities, assessing which rival might use these tactics. He understood the message clearly. Someone believed Marin was becoming important to him. That assumption placed her in danger. Dorian knew he had to get ahead of the situation before it escalated further. As Dorian analyzed the threats, his mind kept returning to the simple interactions Marin shared with Isla. Those peaceful moments highlighted how fragile everything around them truly was. He realized how easily their visits could be disrupted by a single miscalculation. The idea of Marin being harmed because of him struck harder than he expected. He had lost Amelia without warning, and the possibility of losing someone else who mattered to Isla felt unbearable. He set his jaw, knowing he needed to tighten his circle, question loyalties, and determine who was behind the recent unrest within his organization. Dorian sat in his office late into the night, reviewing files and old records. Patterns began emerging that he hadn't noticed before. Shifts in behavior, unexplained absences, financial discrepancies, and subtle fractures spreading through his leadership team. The realization pressed on him. Someone inside his organization might be orchestrating these events. He leaned back in his chair, piecing together details, analyzing motives, and weighing the histories of those closest to him. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Amelia's death and the current threats were not separate events. Someone had been working in the shadows for years. Dorian called in one of the few men he trusted completely, assigning him the task of protecting Marin from a distance. The man understood immediately and prepared to shadow her routine without drawing attention. Dorian emphasized the importance of subtlety, wanting Marin to feel safe without realizing the depth of the threat. The bodyguard took his position near her apartment building, watching the street carefully. Dorian's instructions were clear: intervene only if danger escalated, but never let her walk alone without a pair of trained eyes nearby. He refused to let Marin become another casualty of his world. Over the next few days, the bodyguard stuck to Marin's path, monitoring her movements from morning until she returned home. Marin continued noticing the man near the bus stop but didn't realize she had another protector positioned nearby. The bodyguard kept detailed reports on every suspicious figure, sending them directly to Dorian. Each update strengthened Dorian's belief that Marin was being targeted intentionally. Her routine revealed patterns easy for an enemy to exploit. He knew he needed a strategy to keep her safe while uncovering the person responsible for turning her into a pawn in a hidden conflict. One afternoon, Marin walked between shifts to buy a coffee from a nearby shop. As she stepped out, she spotted the same unknown man standing across the street. He wasn't pretending to blend in, he simply watched her with the same steady focus as before. Marin quickly turned away, pretending not to notice, and started walking. Her heart thudded uncomfortably as she wondered whether she should alert someone. She thought about telling her manager but feared sounding dramatic. The simple walk back to work suddenly felt longer, heavier, and filled with questions she couldn't answer. When Marin returned to the restaurant, she tried to shake off the tension. She busied herself with refilling drinks, wiping tables, and tending to customers, hoping the steady flow of tasks would distract her. Yet she couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was following each movement she made. Every time the door opened, her shoulders tightened slightly as she looked up to see who walked in. She reminded herself that there had been no direct threat, only strange behavior she didn't understand. Still, she couldn't deny that something around her life had shifted in a way she didn't expect. Meanwhile, the bodyguard reported the appearance of additional figures watching Marin's movements, sometimes from across the street, and other times from parked cars. They never approached, but their presence was too consistent to be coincidence. Dorian read each report with growing concern, realizing this wasn't random surveillance. Someone was tracking Marin's routine with intention. He tightened the scope of the investigation, directing several men to focus exclusively on uncovering who sent the watchers. Dorian couldn't risk confrontation too early. He needed information more than retaliation. The shadows around Marin confirmed that the threat was growing. Dorian decided to visit the restaurant alone that evening, leaving Isla at home with her nanny. He walked through the door with a calm expression, but beneath it was an urgency he couldn't ignore. Marin noticed immediately that Isla wasn't with him and wondered whether something had happened. She approached with her usual warmth, but Dorian's posture hinted at worry. He struggled to express concern without revealing too much. Marin sensed the strain but didn't press, waiting for him to find his words. The atmosphere between them shifted, filled with quiet questions neither was ready to voice. A server walked by and accidentally dropped a set of silverware near their table. The clatter broke the moment, scattering the tension for a brief second. Marin stepped aside to help, and Dorian used the distraction to steady himself. He needed to warn the restaurant's owner privately without alarming Marin. After Marin returned to her duties, Dorian asked the owner for a quick word. The owner led him to a corner near the kitchen, where Dorian quietly explained the need for increased caution around the building. The owner nodded slowly, confused but respectful of Dorian's seriousness. As Dorian left the conversation with the owner, Marin observed him from a distance. She could sense something had shifted, though she didn't know what. Dorian walked past her with a quiet nod, his expression heavier than usual. Marin felt a stir of concern but held back, unsure of her role in the growing tension. She returned to her responsibilities, yet her thoughts kept drifting back to Dorian's uneasy mood. When her shift ended, she stepped outside, hoping the evening air would clear her mind. That hope faded quickly when she noticed someone across the street watching her again. The man she had seen earlier stood near a lamppost, hands tucked in his pockets, eyes fixed on her as though waiting for her to make a move. Marin paused at the door, pretending to check her phone, trying to stay composed. She wondered if she should re-enter the restaurant, but pride held her in place. She didn't want fear to dictate her steps. She forced herself to keep walking, even though each movement felt heavier. Behind her, the man remained still, tracking her path. She didn't know she wasn't alone. Dorian's bodyguard followed at a steady distance. Marin reached her apartment building and slipped inside quickly, locking the door behind her. She leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. She didn't understand why she was being watched, or what the men wanted. She checked her window blinds, ensuring they were closed tightly. She tried to convince herself the danger might be exaggerated in her mind, but the repeated encounters said otherwise. She walked around her apartment, restlessly, unable to settle. She considered calling someone, but her list of people who might understand felt painfully short. The next morning, Marin stepped out of her apartment to find a folded note wedged under her door. She picked it up cautiously and unfolded it with slow care. The note contained a single symbol drawn in dark ink and a time written below it. There was no name, no explanation, only the unfamiliar mark. Marin stared at it, confused and uneasy. It didn't resemble anything she recognized. She wondered if it was a prank or something more serious. Uncertain of what to do, she crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash, hoping it meant nothing. Later that day, Dorian's bodyguard retrieved the discarded note after Marin left for work. He sent a photo of the symbol to Dorian, who felt the impact immediately. The symbol matched one used years ago by the individual believed to have killed Amelia. Pain and anger surged through him as old memories resurfaced with renewed clarity. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was provoking him, choosing Marin intentionally to reopen a wound he tried to seal. Dorian realized the threat was now personal, calculated, and tied directly to his past. The connection forced him into a mindset he hadn't touched in years. Dorian gathered his senior lieutenants for a private meeting, demanding updates on loyalty issues throughout the organization. Some men shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, while others seemed overly eager to reassure him. He watched their reactions closely, listening for inconsistencies. The tension in the room pulsed quietly as he questioned each member. He noticed gaps in their answers, small contradictions and unexplained movements. When he dismissed them, he was left with more questions than before. The closed door behind them marked a boundary he knew he needed to cross soon, identifying the traitor hidden within his leadership. In the privacy of his office, Dorian spread old case files across his desk, comparing them with new reports from the last several months. Patterns emerged in small details, the timing of certain meetings, changes in loyalties, and repeated appearances of the same individuals. One name began surfacing repeatedly in places it shouldn't have appeared. Dorian leaned forward, tracing the line connecting Amelia's final days to the present threats. He wasn't ready to act without solid proof, but the pattern formed a roadmap he could no longer ignore. Someone close to him had betrayed both him and his wife. Maren tried to continue her routine as best she could, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had been shifted off-center. She noticed the same watchers at different points throughout her day, lingering near the bus stop or leaning casually near the restaurant's entrance. She didn't know whether their presence was intentional or coincidental, but the repeated encounters rattled her. She considered telling Dorian but hesitated, unsure how he would react or whether she was overstating her concerns. The uncertainty made her feel even more isolated as she tried to navigate her daily tasks. The restaurant owner noticed Marin's distracted behavior and asked if she needed time off, offering a supportive shoulder. Marin appreciated the gesture but declined, knowing she needed the income and didn't want to appear fragile. She continued working her full schedule, hoping the routine would help her stay grounded. She kept checking the windows, scanning for familiar faces. Each time she saw someone lingering, she questioned whether they were a threat or just another passerby. Her discomfort grew with each passing day, leaving her unable to relax even in the familiar walls of the restaurant. Dorian parked across the street one evening, watching Marin through the restaurant window. He didn't enter because he didn't want to draw attention to her. Instead, he observed the space, noting who came and went, who lingered too long, and who stared toward Marin more than necessary. His eyes stayed sharp, tracking each potential threat. He hadn't expected to be there, hidden in the shadows of his car, but protecting her had become an instinct he couldn't ignore. Every unfamiliar face raised suspicion, and he felt the pressure of a deeper conflict waiting to surface. Inside the restaurant, Marin sensed something unusual outside without knowing Dorian watched from across the street. She felt the same pressure she'd been experiencing all week, a quiet weight that made her glance at the windows repeatedly. Her coworkers chatted, unaware of the shift in her focus. She forced herself to smile at customers, yet her mind remained locked on the idea that someone was waiting for her. The hours moved slowly, each new face adding to her unease. When she stepped into the kitchen for a brief break, she tried to steady herself, but the discomfort stayed strong. After her shift ended, Marin stepped out the back door instead of the front, hoping the quieter exit would ease her nerves. The alley behind the restaurant was dim, but she didn't see anyone immediately. She exhaled lightly and began walking, only for a shadow to shift near the far end of the building. The shape of a person became clearer as they stepped closer to the streetlight. Marin froze for a second before continuing forward, trying not to show fear. She kept moving toward the main street, unaware that Dorian had already stepped out of his car to follow her route from a distance, ensuring she wasn't alone. Across the street, the same man who had been watching her from the bus stop earlier reappeared. He stood under a flickering light, attention focused entirely on her. Marin quickened her pace, desperate to reach a safer, busier area. The man didn't move, but continued tracking her with his eyes, as though memorizing everything. Dorian watched the interaction with controlled intensity, ready to intervene if the danger escalated even slightly. Marin made it to a crowded corner and blended with pedestrians. Still, she felt the man's gaze lingering even as she walked away, unsure how much longer she could handle this growing fear. The next morning, Marin stepped outside and found a photo tucked under her windshield wiper. Her stomach tightened as she pulled it free, expecting another meaningless note. Instead, she stared at an image of herself serving Dorian and Isla at the restaurant. The angle suggested it had been taken secretly from across the room. She looked around quickly, searching the street for anyone watching. The photo felt targeted, intentional, and meant to unsettle her. She slipped it into her jacket and hurried inside her car, unsure whether she should drive to work or warn someone first. Dorian received an envelope at his home that same morning. Inside was an identical photo of Marin, standing beside him and Isla during one of their quiet dinners. The sender clearly wanted him to know Marin was being monitored. The picture had been printed in the same grainy tone used in old surveillance files. Dorian recognized the handwriting on the envelope as the same style from the symbol note. His grip tightened as he processed what this meant. Someone was deliberately connecting Marin to his past. The threat wasn't vague anymore. It had become precise and personal. Dorian contacted an old investigator he trusted from years earlier, a man who had stepped away from official work but maintained access to information. He sent him copies of the symbol and the photo, requesting immediate analysis. The investigator studied the materials and recognized details tied to Amelia's case, including the mark that appeared near the crime scene. He agreed to reopen his private notes and look for connections. Dorian watched his expression, knowing the man wouldn't take the request lightly. The resurfacing of these symbols meant the killer, or someone connected to him, was active again. The investigator traveled to a quiet workspace and pulled out boxes of files from Amelia's case, many of which he had kept out of frustration after authorities closed the investigation prematurely. He spread the records across a long table, comparing old entries with the new information. Bank records, witness statements, coded messages, and unexplained transactions surfaced again. A particular series of payments caught his eye, small sums routed through different accounts, but always tied to someone inside Dorian's organization. The pattern repeated too consistently to be chance. He realized the betrayal had been unfolding for years, slowly and quietly. Meanwhile, Marin arrived at work shaken but determined to hide her nerves. She kept the photo hidden in her apron pocket, unsure whether to tell the restaurant owner or keep it to herself. She couldn't understand why someone would photograph her, especially during a simple interaction with a child. Every time the door opened, she felt a pulse of worry as she checked the faces walking in. She tried to maintain her usual warmth, greeting customers and managing her tables, but her attention constantly drifted to the image tucked close to her body. Fear sat quietly beneath every movement she made. Dorian received another update from his bodyguard confirming that Marin's watchers had multiplied. New faces lingered around the restaurant, some pretending to be pedestrians, others loitering near corners with no clear purpose. The report ignited a new level of urgency inside him. He had tried to avoid dragging Marin into his world, yet his enemies didn't care about boundaries. They had chosen her because she mattered. The realization made his hands clench. He ordered the bodyguard to increase protection and narrow the distance, making sure Marin wasn't left exposed for even a moment. That evening, Dorian reviewed more internal documents sent by his advisor and recognized small inconsistencies that now stood out. Payment logs showed unauthorized withdrawals during the weeks surrounding Amelia's death. Meeting schedules showed a lieutenant attending private gatherings with people outside their usual circles. Dorian began connecting names with dates, mapping movements and communications. The more he studied the information, the more a single name appeared at critical intersections. He leaned forward in his chair, adjusting each file into place as a growing sense of clarity tightened inside him. Loyalty had cracked long before the present conflict. Some of Dorian's lieutenants had grown restless, questioning his decisions, avoiding eye contact, or offering half-hearted input during meetings. He noticed these shifts long before Marin entered the picture, but he had underestimated their significance. Now, with the photo of Marin and the resurfaced symbol, he realized the rebellion inside his organization wasn't new. It had been building for years. He suspected the leader responsible for Amelia's death was also behind the new attempts to provoke him. The realization carried the weight of betrayal, forcing Dorian to reconsider every relationship he had trusted since taking control of the family. The investigator continued tracing financial movements tied to the old case. He noticed repeated transfers that directed money toward a lieutenant named Rocco, a man known for ambition and close involvement during Amelia's final weeks. Rocco's name appeared in bank logs, coded messages, and old surveillance notes from years earlier. The investigator remembered Rocco's presence at Amelia's memorial service, where he had offered empty condolences. Now the pieces aligned. He called Dorian with the updated findings, his voice steady. The evidence suggested that Rocco had orchestrated key events surrounding Amelia's death. The confirmation hit Dorian with controlled intensity. Dorian studied Rocco's file with a hardened focus, replaying memories of their past interactions. He recalled moments when Rocco seemed overly eager to insert himself into leadership decisions, always framing his suggestions as helpful. He remembered times when Rocco arrived late to meetings without explanation and brushed off Dorian's questions with vague excuses. Now that Marin was being targeted, everything pointed toward Rocco's involvement. Dorian knew confronting him too early would only push the traitor deeper into hiding. He needed undeniable proof, not just suspicions, before making a move that would shift the balance within the organization permanently. Marin's anxiety increased as she noticed more unfamiliar men appearing near the restaurant. They never spoke to her, but their watchful presence made her dread each step she took outside. She tried to keep her routine steady, even though every instinct urged her to stay home. The stress began affecting her sleep, leaving her tired during shifts. She attempted to act normal around Isla and Dorian, though the strain showed in her forced smiles. She didn't want them to worry, unaware that Dorian already knew far more about the growing danger than she realized. The restaurant owner began noticing how jumpy Marin had become. One afternoon he quietly asked whether she wanted a few days away to rest. Marin appreciated the concern but refused, needing the income and fearing the problems would follow her even if she stayed home. She tried to reassure herself that the watchers wouldn't act in the open. Still, she found her eyes drifting to the windows constantly. The once friendly environment felt uneasy with each passing hour. She wished someone could explain what was happening, but she didn't know whom to approach or whether anyone could help. Dorian made his presence known one evening by stepping inside the restaurant with a calm but guarded expression. Marco noticed him immediately and felt a sense of relief she didn't expect. He didn't bring Isla, which concerned her. He observed the room with deliberate attention, noting which customers looked too long at Marian, or glanced suspiciously at the windows. He remained composed, yet his posture suggested readiness. Marian approached him, but he didn't want to draw attention to their conversation. He simply nodded toward her as she passed, making it clear he was there for her safety. Dorian stayed outside after leaving the restaurant, watching from his car as Marin finished her shift. He noticed how carefully she checked the street before stepping outside, confirming his suspicion that she felt unsafe. The thought sparked a mixture of anger and determination. He refused to let her navigate danger alone. When she walked toward the bus stop, he followed at a controlled distance, ensuring no one approached her. He saw the familiar watcher on the opposite sidewalk, standing still as if waiting for the right moment. Dorian tightened his grip on the steering wheel, prepared to intervene instantly if needed. As the week went on, Dorian's advisor noticed growing tension within the organization. Some lieutenants avoided meetings, arriving late or leaving early. Others whispered in corners, assuming Dorian wasn't aware of their quiet dissent. The advisor offered explanations that lacked depth, and Dorian began to sense inconsistency in his tone. He watched the advisor carefully, noting new behaviors that didn't align with the loyalty he once trusted. Every detail added to the rising pressure. Dorian knew a confrontation would come soon, but he needed more clarity before making irreversible decisions that could destabilize everything he built. One afternoon, Marin walked toward her car after a double shift and found another photo tucked beneath her windshield wiper. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the same angle, capturing her with Dorian and Isla. Someone was keeping track of their interactions. She slipped the photo into her bag, fearing what it meant. She didn't know whether to tell the police, but she doubted they could help, especially without clear evidence. She scanned the street again, hoping she was alone. Across the road, the same watcher leaned against a building, quietly studying her every move. Dorian received a second envelope delivered to his estate, containing a new print of Marin's photo. The message was unmistakable. Someone wanted him to believe Marin was involved in his world beyond her control. He felt a cold anger settle inside him as he studied the image again. The connection between Amelia's death and Marin's danger grew stronger. The same symbol from years ago, the repeated surveillance, and the targeted photos formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Dorian knew the enemy intended to draw him out emotionally, hoping he would make a mistake. He refused to give them that advantage. Dorian contacted the investigator again, who confirmed the troubling links connecting Rocco to suspicious activities leading up to Amelia's death. The investigator believed Rocco used financial channels to disguise payments from outside parties, pointing to a joint operation. Dorian realized Rocco might not have acted alone, but instead served as the bridge between internal betrayal and external enemies. The investigator urged him to proceed carefully, as the network around Rocco might still be active. Dorian listened with focused attention, knowing that uncovering the truth required patience and strategy. The pieces of the past and present were aligning far too neatly. Dorian spent the evening reviewing years of internal records. He searched old meeting logs, financial transfers, and coded notes that had once seemed insignificant. Each page revealed more evidence pointing toward Rocco. The lieutenant had always been ambitious, but Dorian never suspected the depth of his involvement. Now everything fit: the timing of Amelia's death, the slow rise of internal rebellion, and the recent threats toward Marin. Betrayal had been growing inside the organization like a hidden crack that now threatened to break open. Dorian knew he needed to act soon to prevent further escalation. Marin struggled to sleep for several nights, the fear of being watched slipping into her dreams. When she closed her eyes, she pictured the silent faces, the repeated watchers, and the strange symbol on the note. She started packing a small bag, unsure whether she should leave town or stay and hope the danger would fade. She hated the idea of running, but the stress of constant surveillance made her feel trapped. She considered talking to Dorian, yet something held her back. She didn't want to burden him or complicate whatever role he played in her growing fear. The situation worsened when a third photo appeared on her car after another late shift. This time the angle came from outside the restaurant window, showing her leaning toward Isla with a smile. The image felt even more invasive. Markern stuffed it into her bag and walked quickly toward home. She checked behind her repeatedly, but the street remained empty. The fear building inside her became difficult to ignore. She knew something was happening around her life that she couldn't explain. She wondered how much longer she could continue pretending everything was fine. Dorian's next report from his bodyguard confirmed that 3 different men had taken turns watching Marin's movements. Their routines suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The bodyguard captured photos of each man and sent them to Dorian, who recognized one of them as a known associate of Rocco. That single connection tied everything together. Dorian felt the shift inside him turn from confusion to certainty. Rocco wasn't just involved, he had orchestrated the renewed threats. The betrayal felt personal, direct, and unforgivable. Dorian prepared himself mentally for the confrontation he knew was coming soon. Dorian visited the restaurant again, staying outside so Marin wouldn't feel pressured by his presence. He watched her move through her shift, noticing how her shoulders carried tension she tried to hide. Her smiles were still kind, but not as natural as before. He saw the strain she carried and blamed himself for letting her get caught in a conflict she never asked for. He promised himself that he wouldn't allow her or Isla to be harmed by the forces gathering around them. The time had come to confront the traitor who had caused years of pain. As Dorian prepared to take action, he studied Rocco's recent behavior and confirmed the man had been circling the restaurant more frequently. Rocco seemed to believe his surveillance remained unnoticed, unaware that Dorian had already connected every piece. Dorian waited for the right moment to strike, gathering enough evidence to ensure the confrontation couldn't be dismissed or twisted. The weight of betrayal settled heavily, but so did resolve. He refused to let this threat continue. The next steps had to be precise, measured, and decisive. The future of his family and organization depended on it. Marin continued trying to hide her growing fear, but her interactions with customers became quieter as her thoughts wandered. She worried about walking home alone again and considered staying with a friend for a few days. She kept checking the windows for familiar faces, constantly on alert. When she handled her tables, she did so with a forced calmness that didn't match her usual warmth. She didn't know the full scope of what surrounded her. She only knew her life had shifted into something she could no longer understand or navigate alone. The investigator continued tracing the financial trail leading back to Rocco, uncovering several offshore accounts used to disguise payments made over the years. He cross-referenced these with internal documents from Dorian's organization and found matching timestamps that placed Rocco near Amelia's location before her death. Each discovery strengthened the case. He shared the findings with Dorian, who listened in steady silence. The truth had finally taken shape, revealing the extent of betrayal woven into his life. Dorian knew he couldn't delay any longer. The person who had destroyed his family was no longer hidden by shadows. The investigator urged caution, advising Dorian not to confront Rocco without additional support. But Dorian already felt the rising urgency to protect Marin and Isla. The unfolding evidence confirmed everything he feared. Rocco had positioned himself cleverly within the organization, avoiding suspicion while orchestrating events over many years. Dorian thanked the investigator for his work and promised to follow up soon. He closed the call and stood in the quiet of his office, allowing the weight of the betrayal to settle fully. For the first time in years, the path forward felt undeniably clear. Dorian retrieved a list of names connected to Rocco's financial movements and began reorganizing his security structure. He quietly reassigned trusted individuals to key positions where they could intercept threats. Without alerting the traitor, he positioned guards around Isil's school and placed an increased team around his estate. He made sure Marin had additional protection as well, though she remained unaware of the extent. The security tightening signaled a shift in his leadership, preparing for the confrontation he knew was coming. Dorian kept every move invisible, not wanting to alarm those who did not need to know. He called the investigator again, requesting confirmation on one last detail surrounding Amelia's final day. The investigator revisited old footage and recognized a familiar vehicle near the scene, later tied to Rocco through a separate case. This detail sealed the truth. Dorian felt something inside him harden, not anger, but a steady resolve built on years of unanswered questions. He realized the threats toward Marin were an attempt to reopen the wound and destabilize him. Instead, they strengthened his determination. He thanked the investigator once more, ending the call with a clear plan forming in his mind. Marin, unaware of the unfolding investigation, began packing a small suitcase with essential items. She didn't have a clear plan, but the repeated threats had pushed her to consider leaving town temporarily. She placed clothes, toiletries, and a journal inside the bag, feeling both embarrassed and terrified by the situation. She didn't want to tell her coworkers because she feared being dismissed again. Although she longed for comfort, she preferred to handle her fears quietly. The decision to stay elsewhere for a few nights felt like the safest option, even though she had no idea where she would go. That evening, Maren stepped outside her apartment and saw another unfamiliar figure leaning against a nearby wall. Her heart dropped. This man was different from the others, older, more guarded, and clearly not trying to blend in. She hesitated before walking toward her car. Every step felt heavier, as she wondered whether he would follow. She kept her gaze low, hoping not to draw attention. Her keys trembled in her fingers as she unlocked the door. She managed to get inside and lock the car. When she glanced in the rearview mirror, the man had vanished from sight. Dorian's bodyguard sent a message confirming that the men watching Maren had grown more aggressive. Dorian read the update with increasing concern, realizing the danger had reached a critical point. He called his driver and requested the car immediately. He could no longer rely solely on surveillance. He needed Maren somewhere safe. He instructed the bodyguard to follow Maren discreetly and intervene only if necessary. As he prepared to leave the estate, Ela wandered into his office, rubbing her eyes. He lifted her gently and reassured her before placing her back with the nanny. Protecting Maren now became urgent. Dorian ordered a trusted team member to retrieve Maren that evening. The car drove to her apartment building, parking a short distance away. Maren stepped outside with her small suitcase, startled when a man approached carefully and addressed her by name. She tensed, unsure whether to trust him, but the man explained he worked for Dorian and was sent to keep her safe. The relief in Maren's eyes was mixed with confusion. Unsure what else to do, she accepted and stepped into the vehicle. As they drove away, she glanced out the window, feeling the intensity of the moment. Maren kept her focus on the road ahead, wondering whether she had made the right decision by accepting the ride. The driver maintained a calm posture, guiding her through the quiet streets until they reached a secluded property surrounded by tall trees and iron gates. The car rolled through as the gates opened slowly. Maren recognized the sense of safety the moment they entered the grounds. Dorian waited near the entrance of the large house, his expression softened by concern. As she stepped out of the car, Maren felt a mixture of fear and comfort wash over her. Dorian guided Maren into the house, keeping his voice steady as he explained this property belonged to his family and was heavily secured. Although she felt overwhelmed, the controlled environment eased her nervousness. She followed Dorian through a hallway until they reached a warm living room. He gestured for her to sit. The room felt lived in, with books, framed photos, and soft lighting that created a peaceful atmosphere. Maren sat down quietly, unsure what to say. She sensed that Dorian had something important to share, and her unease blended with curiosity as she waited for him to speak. Maren looked around the room and was surprised to see Isla run in, smiling brightly when she saw her. Isla rushed to her side and hugged her gently, burying her face against Maren's arm. Maren instinctively held her close, recognizing how rare it was for Isla to show such affection. Dorian watched the moment with quiet gratitude. He knew bringing Maren here was the right decision. The connection between Isla and Maren made the situation clearer. Maren returned the embrace and sensed how deeply Isla relied on her presence. The unexpected reunion softened some of her lingering fear. Dorian invited Maren to sit again and began explaining the truth about Amelia's death. He didn't provide every detail, but he offered enough for Maren to understand why she had been targeted. She listened carefully, feeling shock build as she realized the danger surrounding her wasn't random at all. Dorian explained the symbol, the surveillance, and the resurfacing connections that linked everything back to the traitor within his organization. Maren felt overwhelmed but grateful for his honesty. The truth finally gave shape to the fear she had been carrying. It also explained why her life had shifted so sharply. Maren quietly processed the explanation, trying to absorb the weight of everything she had learned. She realized she had become a target not because of anything she had done, but because she mattered to Isla and unintentionally to Dorian. The thought shook her, yet she found comfort in knowing there was a reason behind the events. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and nodded slowly. Dorian saw the resilience in her eyes, which made him admire her strength even more. In that moment, Maren understood her involvement was no longer accidental. It was tied to a much larger conflict. While Maren and Dorian sat in the living room, two of Dorian's closest men spotted Rocco near the restaurant. They reported the sighting immediately, confirming he had returned to the area where much of the recent surveillance originated. Dorian felt a surge of tension as he listened to the update. Rocco's boldness confirmed he believed he remained undetected. Dorian realized this was the moment to act. He gathered key members of his trusted team and ordered them to locate Rocco without drawing attention. He wanted the confrontation handled swiftly, without giving the traitor a chance to escape. Dorian stayed with Marin and Isla until he received a message confirming Rocco's exact location. His men followed discreetly, waiting for the right moment to intervene. As the tension in Dorian's expression sharpened, Marin sensed that the situation had escalated further. She didn't know the details, but she understood he had reached a turning point. Isla rested her head on Marin's lap, while Dorian kept his phone close. He felt torn between staying near them and resolving the threat, but he knew protecting them meant facing the source directly. The next steps would determine everything. His men cornered Rocco near a quiet side street behind the restaurant. They surrounded him silently, preventing any escape. Rocco raised his hands slowly, pretending innocence, though his expression revealed recognition of their intentions. They escorted him into an unmarked vehicle and sent a brief message to Dorian confirming the capture. Dorian read the words with a steady seriousness, feeling the final piece fall into place. The confrontation he had anticipated for years was now inevitable. He informed Marin and Isla that business demanded his attention, promising he would return as soon as possible. Dorian met his team at a secure location, where Rocco was held under strict guard. The room was dim, furnished only with necessary equipment. Rocco stood between two guards, his expression shifting from confidence to worry as Dorian entered. For the first time, the mask Rocco had worn for years slipped. Dorian asked pointed questions about Amelia's death, tracking Rocco's reactions carefully. Though Rocco tried to evade, enough details surfaced to confirm the betrayal beyond doubt. The quiet acknowledgement passing between them signaled the end of a long-hidden deception. The truth had finally come to light. Rocco attempted to justify his actions, claiming he had been pushed by outside forces, but Dorian remained unmoved. He studied Rocco's mannerisms, noting the subtle shifts that revealed guilt. Dorian remembered the trust he had once placed in this man and felt a quiet ache for the loyalty broken so thoroughly. He made a decision with calm clarity. The guards escorted Rocco away to face consequences that would remove the threat permanently. Dorian watched him disappear down the corridor. The path to peace for Isla and Marin required closing this chapter firmly. Once the confrontation ended, Dorian returned to the secure property where Marin and Isla waited. The relief on Marin's face when she saw him confirmed how deeply she had worried. Isla ran to him, hugging his leg tightly. Dorian knelt to hold her, feeling the exhaustion settle into his bones. He led them both inside, where the warmth of the home replaced the tension of the night. The danger surrounding them had not vanished completely, but the core threat had been removed. A fragile sense of calm began creeping back into their lives. As the hours passed, the house grew quieter. Dorian and Marin sat together while Isla slept peacefully in the next room. They talked softly about everything that had transpired, each sharing their fears and uncertainties. Marin admitted how scared she had been, but also how grateful she felt to finally understand what was happening. Dorian confessed how much he hated dragging her into danger. Their conversation formed a quiet bridge between their worlds. Marin felt a sense of understanding develop between them, one shaped by honesty rather than fear. She no longer felt alone in her experience. Dorian explained that although Rocco had been removed, the aftermath would take time to settle. Marin listened closely, understanding that healing from such betrayal required more than decisive actions. She reassured him that she wasn't afraid of staying involved, as long as Isla remained safe. Dorian felt a sense of gratitude settle in his chest. Marin's willingness to understand the complexity of his world made him feel less isolated. They discussed possible steps moving forward, knowing the situation required patience. The moment between them felt grounded, shaped by trust that had grown through hardship. As the night progressed, Dorian walked Marin through the security measures in place around the property. She observed how carefully everything was planned, from surveillance to patrols posted along the perimeter. He explained that these precautions were intended to give Isla a stable future. Marin admired the depth of his commitment to his daughter. Watching him describe each detail helped her understand his protective nature. She realized she had misjudged his stern exterior. The man standing before her was not defined by power alone, but by the love he carried for the people he valued most. Dorian received confirmation from his men that Rocco's network had been dismantled quickly. Several members surrendered without conflict, while others fled. The core of the threat had been neutralized. He turned off his phone and finally allowed himself to breathe. Marin sat beside him on the couch, offering quiet support. They both felt the weight of the past days ease slightly. Dorian watched Isla sleeping through the baby monitor, feeling a rare sense of hope. Marin rested her hand lightly on the armrest, close enough to feel his presence but not intruding. The following morning, sunlight filled the room with a soft brightness. Hila woke early and ran straight to Marin, hugging her tightly. The gesture made something warm settle inside Dorian's chest. He realized how deeply Isla had bonded with Marin, and how much Marin had come to mean to both of them. Breakfast was simple and calm, with soft laughter filling the space. For the first time in months, Dorian felt the possibility of a peaceful future. The presence of Marin brought a balance he hadn't thought possible. She had become part of their lives in ways neither of them expected. Dorian stepped outside with Marin later in the day, watching the wind move gently through the trees surrounding the property. He explained that the worst of the danger had passed, though caution would remain necessary. Marin nodded, accepting the reality of his world without fear. She felt grounded by the trust between them, and by the bond she shared with Isla. Dorian looked at her with a quiet resolve, recognizing the beginning of something new. The conflict had revealed the truth, removed the threat, and opened the possibility of a future shaped by safety, healing, and connection.